Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's live stream webinar, Anthos in Production, Real-World Deployments Featuring Anthos on AWS. Before we get started, I would like to go over how you can participate in today's event. You will have the opportunity to submit questions throughout the session by clicking the link in the description below and typing your questions. We will get to them at the end of the presentation. I would now like to introduce our two experts for today's session, Xiaowen Xin, Product Manager at Google, and Miles Ward, CTO at SADA. Take it away.
I'm super excited. Hi, everybody. How are you doing today? This is going to be a fun conversation. Xiaowen and I have been working together on Anthos and Anthos features, and in particular on Anthos for AWS for a long time. So I'm super excited to unpack some of what's being released and what's available, to walk through a whole bunch of questions that I have for her and a few that she has for me, and hopefully hear some great questions from you in the audience about how Anthos for AWS works and what to expect in practice and what are the customers doing. Really, consider this kind of an open season session. Maybe, Xiaowen, can you introduce yourself for the audience so they know who you're talking to and how to interpret maybe where you're going through?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm also super excited to be here and looking forward to asking Miles all the hardest questions and putting him on the spot. So, yeah, my name is Xiaowen. I am a product manager on Anthos, working specifically on Anthos multi-cloud, and in this case, we're launching first on AWS and Azure coming
soon. That is outstanding. So, product management for those in the audience, this is the critical work at Google of making it so that all of our requests and the features that we need, the capabilities that are critical for these products, that they actually come to life. You have to wrangle cats. You got to herd the machine to make it so that it turns out these services. And no more, I think, complex and challenging place to do that than in a system that has to work not just inside Google, but has to work everywhere, has to work across the world. So the product managers that are working hard on Anthos and Anthos in particular for AWS, I think you guys have been doing a particularly complex job. You had a couple of pieces you wanted to walk us through, Xiaowen, maybe an overview of how Anthos on AWS works and what customers can take away from it as a valuable new tool in their tool belt.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I thought I'd run through a few slides first to show everyone a bit more about Anthos and Anthos on AWS. And then I think, Miles, you have a demo for us as well, so we're really looking forward to that. So let's run through a few slides first. All right, so just a quick overview of what Anthos is. So Anthos is an application modernization platform that helps you do a few different things. First, we help you modernize in place. And so if you have workloads running on-prem or in a data center somewhere, you can run Anthos there to help you modernize without moving to the cloud first. So cloud can be a second step. Second, we help you automate policy and security at scale. And so we take a GitOps first approach to help you manage your policy as well as enforce your security across all of your clusters, regardless of where they're running, so that you can take your security and compliance requirements and turn them into technical enforcement. And finally, we provide a consistent operating experience so that regardless of where your clusters are sitting on AWS, GCP, on-prem, or elsewhere, you have that same consistent experience for managing your clusters and your workloads. And we have worked with a third party to quantify the benefits of Anthos. So you can get this report later on offline and take a look. We see that with Anthos, you are seeing actually quite a large ROI in terms of productivity, in terms of time to market. So take a look at that later on. Okay, so digging into Anthos a little bit more, what is it? It is a 100% software stack. So it's this part in blue. It runs on top of GCP in your data center on-prem, on a public cloud like AWS, and on the edge. So this is a layered cake that includes a lot of different components. So you probably heard that Anthos contains Anthos GKE, which is that same distribution of Google Kubernetes engine that you may be familiar with, that conformance production grade Kubernetes distribution that currently runs on GCP and gives you a lot of cool management capabilities. So GKE forms the foundation of Anthos. And on top of that, we have a service mesh built on top of Istio called Anthos Service Mesh. And on top of that, we have a developer interface, a developer platform called Cloud Run. And throughout this entire stack, we have a feature called Anthos Config Management that helps you manage your policy as well as enforce security across the entire stack. And of course, you also get monitoring and logging for your SRE team with cloud logging and monitoring. So taken together, all of this really helps you with managing your entire modernization platform, so that your entire organization, whether it's SREs or developers, everybody can move together and modernize the application together. So we've heard, for example, that managing Kubernetes is hard. We've heard from some customers that managing Istio takes multiple senior engineers. And so we provide all of that together in one package. It's integrated, it's tested together, it's supported by Google. And so, so we are taking on more of the management burden so that you don't have to. All right, and so what we've done with this multi-cloud announcement is that we've taken this Anthos stack and we've moved it to work on other public clouds like AWS and Azure coming. So in AWS specifically, we've added a few features to help it integrate better with AWS. So for example, if you currently have a lot of groups or organizational structures defined with AWS IAM, then we actually support using AWS IAM to authenticate your users into the clusters. And second, if you are currently using, if your workloads are currently using other AWS services like S3, maybe other services as well, we're adding in a feature to help you seamlessly authenticate to those AWS services in a secure way. And finally, if you have your existing secure infrastructure, maybe you have your existing VPCs or security groups that you need to use, that's all good. We support installing into your existing VPC, into your existing environment. And if you want to expose your services with AWS load balancers, that works as well out of the box. Now, why we're here today, I think, is is to talk about some of the use cases that customers are seeing, customers are telling us about. A lot of customers that we know 80% or more of customers have a multi-cloud strategy, and Anthos, one of our big value props is to help you enable that multi-cloud strategy. So we know that a lot of teams, a lot of platform teams, you want to create a platform that helps abstract away the underlying infrastructure. So it doesn't really matter where you deploy. From the developer's perspective, you write the code, you write your Java code the same way. And at deploy time, you can dynamically choose which cloud to deploy to, or potentially deploy into multiple clouds. And you may want to be able to do this for reliability reasons, to be able to fail over between clouds. Maybe for cost reasons, you want to choose the lowest cost environment, or maybe you want to take advantage of the best of breed solutions. So we're hearing all these use cases from customers, and we're helping you with that multi-cloud strategy. And the way we help you do that is is in a few different ways. First, we provide you a consistent operational experience. And so you get a unified experience, whether it's web UI, CLI, GitOps, and so on, to manage all of your clusters. You can use the same authentication method, whether you have Active Directory on-prem, or whether you have Okta or another identity provider. You can use that to authenticate into your Anthos clusters. And of course, there is also unified monitoring, so all of your logs can go into the same place. Although if you want to use a third-party logging solution as well, that's fine with us. And as I mentioned earlier, there's also we also provide you a way to manage configuration and enforce policies, security policies everywhere with Anthos Config Management. Now, one level above that is service management. And we provide also a way for you to do multi-cluster, multi-cloud service management. So with Anthos Service Mesh, which is built on top of Istio, it comes with a couple of cool features. So one is uniform service addressability. So for example, regardless of where your service is running, the client can use the same name to access that service, even if the service gets migrated from one cloud to another in that process. So the service mesh takes care of directing your traffic to the right target service, regardless of where that service currently sits. And that includes VMs as well. So if the client is a VM, that works as well. And what's coming in the space is that we're actually we're going to be providing best practice guidance for global load balancing. So for north-south traffic that's coming into the cluster, we'll be providing more guidance around that. So that was a really, really quick overview. And I hear, Miles, that you have an awesome demo for us.
Ah, who doesn't want shiny demos? So the cool part about this demo is everybody in the audience can follow along. So if you type in the same stuff that I type in, you should see the same stuff that I'm seeing. So I'm going to share my screen. So I'm going to take over from Xiaowen. It is awesome when she presents, but sometimes I got to steal how this works. So if you go to this handy dandy browser you've heard of, it's a pretty snazzy thing. Everybody can see google.com, I'm assuming. Go instead to anthosdemo.sada.com. Oh, not there. How about anthosdemo.sada.com? See, I'm so good at typing. Now, this is a web page. People have heard of web pages before. Not a super complicated thing to have a web page. It has like little buttons on it. It has this big green thing called reload. I encourage you with reckless abandon to smash this reload button as many times as you want. So you'll note that the picture looks all funny and flipping around and it changes colors. What does all that stuff mean? So if you want to have somebody else explain it, you can read here. But if you want to have me explain it, I'll just tell you what's going on. This is a web application deployed on AWS and GKE. And if I click enough times, eventually it'll turn green. Come on, there it goes. Oh, I was there for 2 seconds there. And on a box called a toaster, a hardware appliance running Anthos on-prem. So that's an application that is distributed across all three, deployed to all three using the same steps, and managed all using Anthos. If you want to see what that looks like in the cloud platform, this is the project that we manage this in. If I go over to Kubernetes engine, no smoke, no mirrors. Here are all the clusters that are running in this project. One of those is pretty normal, like an Anthos GCP cluster running in GKE. It has some memory. If I want to connect to it, I can boss it around. Another is an Anthos on-prem cluster. So this is probably what you already think of as Anthos. It is a registered cluster. That means it's a physical host someplace. And it runs the Anthos software. It has a little more poop. It's got 12 CPUs and 25 gigs of RAM. Ooh, snazzy. The cluster here that says provider AWS is actually GKE running on the AWS side. This system exposes a set of services, this Anthos Anywhere demo service, this Anthos Anywhere demo GCP service. Each of these load balanced application versions are set up to distribute the page that you saw. And we use a couple of different tools to support that. Today, we use a VM instance to create a load balancer integration between the on-prem environment and the rest. You can see the architecture for that presented here. So same application running in AWS behind AWS's ELB. It runs in GCP behind an HTTP proxy instance to allow us to load balance to the on-prem infrastructure that's connected to SADA's corporate network. Here it shows us doing it the way we do with lots of our customers, where we actually deploy it on 4G. So you can stick this out at a customer's environment or in a remote location and still have the same centrally deployable, coordinated infrastructure using the same APIs, using the same control tools, all built on GCP. Not so bad. It's like the easiest demo in the world. Super straightforward. So
That is awesome. I've been looking forward to that demo for a super long time. So
it's an easy, tidy one, right? Like nice when you just get to like have it work and smash the button and oh look, there's it's on AWS. And we've had one time we were running this demos together with a customer, and I set their expectation. I say, hey, you're going to see orange for AWS and blue for GKE and green for on-prem. And we smash the button, and all we ever get is green and yellow, green and yellow, green and yellow. It's like smash, 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 smash. And the blue one just won't come up. And I'm like, oh. So I log in, and we have changed the auto scaling rule on the GKE cluster, and it has gone to 0 pods. Somebody poked the wrong button, but the application is still running, which is exactly what customers want to have happen, right? The whole point is that you have arrived in a highly available system that's distributed across the providers. And that's one of the big value propositions that we're seeing with customers today. So it's cool to like accidentally have the demo do exactly what we were expecting to be the value prop.
Yeah, awesome. So, Miles, I think this is a demo that we've talked about for quite a long time, ever since we started working together. From the beginning of the project, we've been talking about, working towards a demo exactly like that. And I think, some of it has been because you've been talking to customers and you've been hearing their use cases, and I think, this really speaks to some of what customers are asking for. So, do you actually want to maybe tell us a little bit more about your conversations with customers, and
Sure.
what have you been hearing, and the types of use cases that you've been hearing?
Sure. SADA's been engaged since the very beginning, in the earliest alpha and beta periods for Anthos on-prem, and then had access very early on, thanks to Xiaowen and others, to the Anthos on AWS bits. There are several major drivers, right? Certainly there are some specialty products and tools that are available in every different environment. Like Google has TPU processors to be able to accelerate machine learning, but maybe you've already written a bunch of code that interacts only with the Inferentio chips that are sitting on AWS. Maybe you already have a whole bunch of code that talks DynamoDB, but you still want to be able to have a web infrastructure that's supported by Kubernetes. Or maybe you're really trying to get down to other managed services that are co-tenanted in those different environments. So being able to have an infrastructure that spans both or all three to get access to local resources, on-prem, that may be reaching back to older database or mainframe infrastructures. There's lots of resources that are more often found in these different environments. Another one that's very top of mind for customers is enabling like real negotiations. So I have two companies, maybe I want to negotiate between GCP and AWS. I could move workloads to either one. I think both of the cloud providers, in my experience, have certainly gotten to a place where it's like, yeah, you say you're going to move, but there's some labor that's required there. If you can change the amount of workload by adjusting a knob or changing the auto scaling rules in Anthos, that is a much more empowered negotiation. I think customers can hold providers to account a lot more aggressively when they have that level of control. Another major driver of interest from what we've seen is just this diaspora, this sprawl of different CI/CD development, management, infrastructure mess, right? Like there's just piles of different tools. And I think it's become complex enough. There are enough new early players. There are a whole bunch of different people that are kind of competing for their place in this stack design and stack gratification kind of market space that I hear from a lot of customers. They want somebody to sort of pull it all together into one big platform that makes sense, and they're going to invest in it for a long time, and they're going to keep making it better. And TK and Google broadly have made that assertion about Anthos. And I think engineers, when they look at the platform's design, they really see the clear thought that went into establishing something as a platform, as a standard that exists across all infrastructures, as kind of an inevitable requirement from our market, as opposed to maybe some more piecemeal or more point-specific approach to the problem. But really, when you get down to it, the demonstration that I just showed is actually the core interest for most customers. I cannot have a system go offline when one of the cloud providers has a problem. My business workload is too critical. my need to be able to distribute traffic and to maintain a customer experience is too valuable. You've got to let me run in a way that lets me take advantage of both. And hopefully you can make it so that that happens without an incredible increase in my operational complexity or in the nuance required to keep that system operating smoothly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that really aligns with what we've heard from customers as well. Some customers are still early. Some customers are looking at Kubernetes only, but a lot of customers are moving onwards, and they're really seeing where they want to be in the future. And a lot of that is distributed, having their platform distributed across multiple clouds and being able to dynamically choose which cloud to deploy on. Now, speaking of multiple clouds versus running on a single one, a lot of customers are looking for higher availability. Do you have a sense of how to quantify that? How to quantify the benefits of higher availability?
Sure. There's a bunch of little anecdotes, right? Both on the performance side and on the sort of uptime side, right? So I think it was Amazon that famously said when their front end adds a millisecond, it's $100,000 a day in lost revenue, right? Like, so all of a sudden, a couple $1,000 in setting up another copy of the infrastructure someplace is just, a rounding error compared to, a system that's running at those kinds of scales. And, I think for many businesses, independent of the dollars lost, like say, for example, you're not processing sales transactions, or, you don't have the ability to interact with somebody as they're going through a sales motion through your website, or if your product, your application is actually a product and you're in delivering that function. We work together with companies that are building software, and that's the only value proposition they give to customers. That if that system goes offline, they're in SLA violations, they pay back against those SLAs. All of that in practice, from what we've seen, the current level of availability from a single cloud provider is pretty great, right? Remember, clouds are like much better than most people's on-prem. The standard that they got to by going to public cloud is a huge step up in terms of availability from sitting in a single data center or even a multiple privately controlled data center kind of a world. But that's the new standard, right? Every company is running on a cloud provider. And if you want to be able to establish as a part of your brand that you can earn the trust with customers that you just won't go offline, you've got to look at how do you span an ever wider set of infrastructure resources. And I think by being in more than one region, especially more than one region per geography, I think the best practices, both for AWS and Google and other providers, suggest that as a standard. That's about as reliable as you can get in a single public cloud, right? Like, it's pretty weird to have 3 regions independently go down without some overall global infrastructure component on one of the provider sides failing, right? It's one thing for one region to have some kind of connectivity issue. I think there have been those on other places, but multi-regional outages are more typically system-wide as opposed to just some weird blast radius. So having 3 or 4 or 5 regions as your deployment doesn't provide the level of incremental benefit that going from just one region to 2 regions provides. And we think the next highest incremental benefit is moving from a couple of regions to a couple of regions on a couple providers. That's really where you kind of cross over into 4 nines plus kind of deliveries. And if I'm looking at companies who sell, who transact business online, who are delivering value through software, those are multi-million-dollar problems. And if you have a material SLA with customers, I think it's very difficult to imagine, taking the full bet on an approach that doesn't have at least the option to take on this other kind of approach. So that's the other piece. Is we see a lot of businesses that want to lay the platform for high availability now, even though they probably will only deploy on one cloud today, right? I just don't want to be set up in an environment where I know as I want to expand or as customers demand that I expand. So you have a software application that needs to sit next to their other installations in another environment. If you set yourself up to make that be a big impediment and it's a resistance to your growth, I think it's hard for you to capture all the opportunity that's available. So that that combination of sort of high availability and customer access, meeting customers where they are, is a critical advantage for the Anthos design.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Miles. I've also heard from customers that for regulatory reasons, they need to have that plan, a BCDR plan, a failover plan, to be able to move to a different cloud when that's needed. So even if they're running on one cloud today, they need to start making those making those plans to be able to move to another cloud when the need comes.
Right.
So
I mean, and imagine if that, it's one thing. I've worked with a lot of companies that are migrating, say, from AWS to GCP, and they say, hey, I have to do some retooling, some re-engineering. I'm gonna have to plan that out. I'm gonna scope it. My team does that. Sometimes it happens really fast. I mean, we did it together with Lush. It took 22 days. It was a super fast move, but most companies take months to do it. If you get a piece of feedback from a regulator that says, you must do this or you are out of compliance, you do not have months to figure it out. You need to do it now. And so if you can set up your platform to work in a way where upon that demand, you can react to that demand. I mean, that sounds to me like, senior engineer getting promoted to VP of engineering pretty damn fast, if you can react to those kinds of challenges with a plum.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, yeah. So, so I think, definitely, it definitely is a value prop that, a goal that Anthos is targeting, and we provide that consistent management experience across different clouds. Now, Miles, I'm gonna give you a pop quiz. so, I know that we have a lot of technical people on the call today as well, and I know a lot of the technical people want to hear a little bit about the architecture of how the entire stack is set up. So, and I know your team has actually done a lot of work. You were one of the first people to deploy it and give us feedback. So you actually have tried both the supported cases and the unsupported cases of how this works.
Yep.
So I thought maybe you could maybe do a quick introduction from a customer's perspective of what the architecture looks like.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and look, as the solutions architect type of guy, I will go through this quick. If there's any sort of specific spots that I mess up, you're the product manager, you're the boss. You tell me if I've stepped on my own toes. So generally, Anthos is a system for deploying Kubernetes clusters and orchestrating those clusters with a surrounding set of tooling. And that deployment means that inside of your AWS account, you're not only going to need the clusters themselves, but a management plane to deploy net new clusters. I want to be able to add clusters all the time. So the architecture for the system is a connection into existing VPCs or new VPCs that get constructed, a set of identity and access management roles, IAM roles, and service accounts that enable access to the resources that are required, and the EC2 instances and elastic load balancers that are deployed to establish a management control plane. That's the infrastructure that's used to then deploy user clusters or additional clusters of Kubernetes that your developers and operations teams can have access to do work. So there is a component, this management cluster, that runs. That management cluster not only interfaces with the AWS APIs to launch new instances and create the resources, but also to deploy Kubernetes and Istio and the other componentry that allow that system to provide value to downstream users. That management cluster also is responsible for an encrypted communication channel back to not the management plane, but the control plane. The control plane for this system runs on the Google side in an infrastructure managed by the GKE team and the Anthos team. So what that means is when a new point release for GKE is made available, you can configure in the GCP console when that takes effect in the management infrastructure, when it gets deployed to user clusters, and you can use the controls that are present in the GKE console, as well as access through things like Cloud Shell to be able to interact and manage that cluster environment that sits on AWS. Critically, if one of the core points of this whole design is like, hey, I want this thing to be highly available. That was the sort of whole point where we started in this conversation. If that connection to Google is severed or goes down. There's some interrupt in the communications between AWS or Google. This is something that happens much more frequently with on-prem Anthos deployments, where you can imagine somebody yanking the Ethernet cord or having an edge deployed location that has intermittent connectivity to the internet. You do not lose the availability of any of the instances running in the cluster. The routes for network that come into those instances, either on Amazon through Elastic Load Balancers or through load balancers that you deploy or connect to on-prem, all of those services, the containers that you've started in Anthos, stay online. They continue to do work. They continue to deliver value. You can even connect with existing clusters that you have by kube control or the command line tools and boss them around. What you can't do is create new clusters. You can't resize or reshape clusters, because those are control plane originated commands that are interrupted by the service. In the same way, you can't also do an update to the point release of the cluster. That's something that's coordinated from the control plane. I think that's the whole bit. Above that also, of course, same as in any other Anthos deployment, you have access to ACM and being able to run Cloud Run and the other supported services that sit inside of the GKE that's deployed to either AWS or on-prem.
Yeah, that's awesome. You get an A+, Miles.
A+, yes. Nice.
Yeah, so I wanted to add to that, but I think I'm really excited about that internal or that unified management interface that Miles talked about, the unified control plane. Yes, there is a web UI, but there's also CLI access. There's also GitOps access, right? So coming in the next couple of quarters is basically an API, a Kubernetes API server endpoint that's going to be available centrally on the Google side. And so regardless of whether you're trying to create a cluster on AWS, on Azure, somewhere else, you can actually use kubectl, or you can use web UI or anything else, but you can use kubectl, you can use set up a GitOps process, give it a YAML file, and it can go create that cluster for you in any one of your configured environments. So I think that really makes management so much easier for a lot of customers when they have a lot of different environments. So I'm kind of excited about that. That's coming later this year.
Wow, that's so. Folks on the webinar, that is roadmap materials that we are receiving in real time. Glorious stuff. Hopefully, we'll get more of those details as we go. That's why I'm very excited about presentations like this. So, I have a few of my own questions. Of course, I think Xiaowen's gotten off a little easy just being able to ask me bits. One of the places that I've heard from customers is they'll treat Anthos as synonymous with Kubernetes. Right, a big value proposition to a bunch of the earliest customers were just, I run Kubernetes on-prem and the operations for it is crazy. Can Anthos just sort of offload those operations for me? And the answer to that in large part is yes. But as you're moving from on-prem to AWS or to Azure to other locations, those places have managed Kubernetes services, right? Amazon has EKS as a service. Can you sort of walk me through the differences, pros and cons, places where EKS is different than, better than, worse than? How does it compare and contrast with an Anthos deployment of GKE on AWS?
Yeah, so I wanted to, I wanted to first point out that Anthos is a lot more than GKE. So we talked about the Anthos stack earlier with the sort of the layered cake, if you will, with the GKE service as the foundation, but you have config management, service management, many other layers on top. So I think it's important for customers to really look at Anthos as an entire stack to help you modernize your entire application. And help multiple teams within your organization modernize, not just the one team that manages Kubernetes. So I think please keep that in mind. And as I said earlier, what we've heard from customers is that when you're running Kubernetes, that's one thing that's hard to do. So we take some of that management burden off of your shoulders. But a lot of people also run other things on top of Kubernetes. Some people are looking at service mesh. I know a lot of people are still early in their exploration of service mesh, but it's something that's on their roadmap. And there are customers that have started using service mesh and are telling us that it takes multiple senior engineers to manage a service mesh because it is quite complicated. And so if you are, in that camp as well, we take the management burden of that service mesh also on us instead of on you. So so keep that in mind as sort of a higher level view of how Anthos is really, it's much more than just Kubernetes. It is config management, service management, all of that on top. Now, speaking specifically for Anthos GKE, what are the sort of the pros and cons of Anthos GKE versus an alternative like EKS? So one thing to know is that it is that same distribution of GKE that you may be already familiar with on GCP. So it's that same conformance, production grade GKE with best practice configuration out of the box. As I mentioned earlier, it is also now integrated with AWS. So you can use AWS IAM to log in. You can use AWS load balancers to expose your services. You can install into your existing AWS VPCs. Now, one thing that is a little bit different between Anthos GKE on GCP versus on AWS is that we are running on EC2 VMs. And so we don't get as much visibility into the operational metrics of these VMs or as much control as we would on GCP. And so some of the management features that you might be familiar with on GCP, like auto upgrade, release channel supports, that is on the roadmap still. So that is not supported out of the box today because it does require a little bit more visibility than we currently have. So it is something that we're working on. And the other difference that you will notice is that because we are running on top of EC2 VMs, they are visible to you. And so they're running in your own AWS account. And so on GKE, on GCP, the management, the control plane, the master nodes are actually hidden from you. It's running in a different project. But on AWS, those control plane nodes, the management layer that Miles talked about, those management cluster nodes, they're all EC2 VMs. They're all visible to you. You get more metrics and monitoring because you see these VMs. But at the same time, it does mean that you are managing these VMs to some degree.
Yeah, it's been an interesting part of some of these earliest pieces. When I worked at AWS, I was a part of the team that built a service on their side called Trusted Advisor. And every time we have these management clusters, I get the little Trusted Advisor message that says, this is a little over provisioned. You could probably use smaller instances. You're not doing enough Kubernetes deployments to sort of warrant the management plane being this heavy. So it's super fun to see all these pieces interact and continue to help people build in the most efficient way possible.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I answered the full question. Yeah, so I think there's actually, let me say one more thing. So we actually, we do, if you are using EKS, one of our biggest goals is not really to our biggest goals is to actually give you the option of doing what works for you. And so we have this quarter a feature that's we're calling BYOK, so bring your own Kubernetes. So you definitely have the option of bringing EKS clusters into Anthos and running the rest of the Anthos stack on top of that. Now, there's definitely pros and cons to that, right? The pros, of course, is that there's no migration necessary for you. So if there's an EKS feature you love, keep using it, that's fine. EKS will, of course, have the best integration with AWS because they're an AWS service. So, you can definitely continue to take advantage of that. And Google will do the integration testing. So we're going to test against a couple of EKS versions. We're testing against OpenShift as well, and other top Kubernetes distributions. So as long as you are running one of those tested versions, then you can rest assured that your version of EKS or OpenShift or another Kubernetes distribution will work with Anthos. Now, I do, of course, have to point out that there are downsides to that approach as well, right? So we've been talking about a single pane of glass for managing all of your clusters. So you would not get that with EKS on Anthos, of course, because you would continue to use your existing EKS tools to manage the lifecycle of that cluster. And of course, with Anthos GKE, because it is that same distribution of Kubernetes that's running across all of your environments for Anthos, you get that same network stack, same identity stack, many of the same add-ons. So Anthos GKE, the management of Anthos GKE will be more similar across different environments versus if you're bring your own Kubernetes into that environment. And finally, Anthos GKE, we are trying to integrate much better with GCP with Anthos. So we have integration with GCP's cloud logging monitoring. We have integration in terms of workload identity, so a way to authenticate into GCP services seamlessly. So these types of integrations you probably would not see with your own cluster. But other than that, I think it is up to the customer to choose. It's up to you whether you want to use Anthos GKE or bring EKS or another Kubernetes into the Anthos environment.
Right. Well, I mean, for a product that was built to enable flexibility, it is super, super exciting to hear it broaden the terms on which it will do that flexible dance, right? It's not just different providers, it's different products from different providers. All of that choice, I think, unlocks customers that have already made sound decisions or made big investments to be able to earn the incremental value that Anthos presents. That's super exciting stuff. Nice work. So I have some questions about about how this works in practice, right? I've seen what we've deployed with some of our customers. I like the implementations that we've done. One of the places that's core to this high availability target is how failover and traffic management works. And there's the specifics, the mechanicals of how you lay that out, following best practices. But also, I think, the kind of higher level question where if you're doing routing and load balancing using a managed service from one of the providers, does that really cut the mustard? Like, I don't think you get all of the high availability goals of being on more than one provider if you don't have more than one load balancer, that kind of thing. Can you walk people through how that works and what choices they have?
Yeah, so that is a really, really, really great question. In fact, it's such a good question that we're actually writing a reference architecture for this. So there will be something written down that people can refer to in the future. So let me break the answer down into actually a couple different pieces. So first, there is east-west traffic, and then there is north-south traffic. So east-west traffic, that is traffic that's typically within your cluster or set of clusters. Maybe it's traffic from a service running in US East 1 trying to call into a service that's running in US West 1. So that is east-west traffic, and then there's north-south traffic, which is traffic that's typically coming in from a load balancer. Maybe it's a browser that your user is using to access your service, and that needs to be load balanced to maybe the closest cluster or load balanced to another cluster based on your requirements. So for east-west traffic, our recommendation actually is to use a service mesh. So of course, we provide one with Anthos called Anthos Service Mesh that's built on Istio. It gives you a few different benefits for this particular use case when you talked about failover, for example. So what you can do with Istio is you can basically deploy the same service in multiple clusters. Let's say you deploy that service actually in Miles's demo, you can deploy that service in AWS, deploy that service in GCP, and then and the client actually doesn't need to know where that service is sitting. The client calls that service using the same name, so there's uniform naming for service discovery. And so and the service mesh then takes care of routing that request to either the closest cluster or to the cluster that you define. And so if the AWS cluster were to go down for whatever reason, then the service mesh can be used to then route that traffic to the GCP cluster. And so I think that uniform naming feature is super useful from a failover perspective. And of course, that's provided by your service mesh. ASM in this case, you could use a different one if you wanted. I want to also mention that VMs are also supported, and so if you have a client that's a VM, that's okay, as long as you install basically an onboard proxy on top of that, and that as well, as long as that onboard proxy is also configured to be part of that same mesh, then it can also enjoy the same services of the uniform naming that I mentioned. So that is for east-west traffic. Now, north-south traffic is definitely you have a lot more options there, and a few different choices. So there's a few different scenarios as well. So for public traffic that's coming in, let's say it's a browser that's coming to you, that's accessing your services. You could choose to use a third-party cloud-based load balancer, for example, Cloudflare, Akamai, Fastly, F5. So there's a few different options there. Now you want to make sure that you want to choose one that has the features that you need. So for example, you may want to choose one that can do health checking, right, to make sure that in the failover scenario that the cluster is still running before you direct traffic there. So health checking maybe use a feature for you that you need. Maybe you want to do geo-based routing. Maybe you want to do traffic splitting. So make sure that the load balancer has the features that you need. So on the Google side, as Miles mentioned, of course we have our own global load balancer. It has thousands of endpoints around the world. A large portion of the internet traffic runs through these load balancers. Now, today for Anthos, we have a feature called Ingress for Anthos that's actually able to take advantage of Google's load balancer to load balance traffic. Now, currently, because that load balancer is sitting on the Google network, currently it works for Anthos on GCP clusters. But we are definitely looking into bringing that to Anthos clusters on other clouds as well. And so in that case, traffic would go through the Google network if that's okay with you. Otherwise, we may need to look into different options. If your clusters are only sitting on AWS, then maybe we need to look into an AWS load balancer. So there's a few different options there. So as far as internet traffic, there is also another deployment option that I've seen from customers where you want to have traffic going through your own data center, right? So sometimes you don't want to have a public load balancer. You want to just have traffic from your load balancer going into your clusters. In that case, you could also build your own load balancer. You could there are open source tools like HA Proxy, Nginx, and so on. Make sure those once again, make sure those have the features that you need, like health checking or traffic splitting and so on. As I mentioned earlier, a reference architecture is coming, so please stay tuned for that. This is an awesome question, Miles, and we should definitely make sure that it's well addressed for all of our customers.
Awesome. Let's change direction here and go to a bit more of a speed round. We have a bunch of incoming customer questions. I want to appreciate everybody on the live stream for sending those in, where we want to tackle those as we can. Here's the first of them. Maybe Xiaowen, you can help tackle this. Great feature of GKE on GCP is the ability to upgrade clusters to newer Kubernetes versions. Does that still work if I deploy on AWS or on-prem? Is that same thing a part of Anthos in those environments?
Sorry, can you say that again? So upgrade clusters to newer versions.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So for sure, I think I think let's actually get a little bit more clarity on this question. So upgrading clusters, for sure, that is supported. Upgrading nodes and control plane, all of that is supported for Anthos, GKE, and AWS. Now, today, I just want to clarify that today we have documentation that's public. Now that documentation is still beta documentation. We have not updated it for the GA yet. And so you won't see all the features that will be available at GA. But let me assure you that the GA version is capable of upgrading. Now, one more thing to add here is I'm not sure the full intent behind the question, but I do want to make sure that you should understand that on GKE, on GCP, there's also a feature called auto upgrade, where we automatically upgrade the cluster for you on a regular basis. And that comes together with another feature called release channels, where you can put your cluster into a stable release channel or rapid channel depending on your, so as a potential, you could have a development cluster on a rapid channel where you can test out new features and then have your production cluster on a more of a stable channel. So that is currently not available for Anthos GK on AWS. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the reasons are that we don't have as much visibility or as much control over the EC2 nodes that are running on AWS. So auto upgrades are not available, but the ability to upgrade is definitely there. In-place upgrade is definitely there for clusters on AWS.
Okay, that is rad. I knew you could do it, but I also knew there were some details, so I appreciate Xiaowen you unpacking that bit. Good and probably simple question from customers. Any update on doing the same thing on Azure? Any sort of view to where that's coming from? Is that something that people have access to, maybe in alpha or something like that?
Yeah. So Azure support is coming. We are still very, very early, I would say, in the Azure support. Now, what you can expect is that it will work roughly the same way as it does for AWS. Now, I know for Azure customers, there are a few features that are probably going to be more important. So, for example, probably a lot more Azure customers want Windows support. And so Azure customers, of course, need to make sure that Active Directory works. So some of the features will be prioritized a little bit differently, will come at a slightly different cadence for Azure versus AWS, because the features needed by our customers are going to be a little different. But I would say the vast majority of features and the way that we prioritize, for example, we prioritize security and reliability, those types of features. So those types of decisions and processes will be very similar, with minor differences based on the requirements of Azure customers versus AWS customers. So Azure is still much earlier on, so we don't currently have a So I would encourage you to actually contact our sales team. That's how you actually can get in touch with us, and then we can actually set up a session, talk to you about the details of Azure support, and then we can also set up a time, probably a little bit later on, to do actual POC and test out the features in your environment. Miles, I think you're muted.
I failed to click the button in the proper way. That is terrible. So one other question that's come in from customers, and this is kind of a higher level piece, right? Like with applications that have been built completely natively to a certain provider, right? Say somebody has followed the well-architected framework. I helped start that on the AWS side. How would you recommend replicating them into other providers? So this is kind of the reverse migration. I think at the beginning of these kinds of descriptions, we were talking about like take your GCP application and then now move it out to other places. If you're going to use Anthos on AWS, does that simplify taking something that was built on AWS and helping it get closer to GCP?
Yeah, so I think I would like to know a little bit more about how this is built natively to a provider. So for example, are you using Lambda? Are you using features that are very specific to that provider? Now, if you are using Lambda, we would recommend that potentially you want to look into Cloud Run for Anthos. It's a very it gives a lot of the same benefits in that it's from a developer perspective, it's serverless. But it is also more portable. So Cloud Run can run on top of Anthos regardless of where your Anthos clusters are running. So I think for this question we probably need to dig a little bit deeper into exactly what types of cloud native what types of features native to that cloud you're currently using. Maybe you're using S3 databases as the S3 database, or maybe you're using AWS IAM. And so in all of those cases, I would say the recommendation would be a little bit different. With AWS IAM, for example, maybe you're using that to manage your groups, users. In that case, we would definitely recommend having that be potentially managed by a third party, and you probably have something like Active Directory on-prem or another service on-prem. So if you have Active Directory or Okta or something like that, then if your users and groups are managed there instead of in AWS IAM, then of course that would then be natively supported really in any Anthos cluster, regardless of where that's running. So I think that question, it'd be good to actually unpack it a little bit more and talk about the details of which features native to a cloud provider is currently being used. What do you think, Miles? What do customers do?
Yeah, we absolutely have. And I think on the one side, we have companies, that have, consumed the Kool-Aid and gone way off the deep end into, provider specific proprietary APIs. Lambda's one you use, DynamoDB, I hear all the time. But the places where the providers have been most proprietary is not down at the individual layer. Like, it's not all that hard to take code that you put in Lambda and pull that code back out and then go to put it in Cloud Run or put it in Knative or put it in Iron Functions, right? Like, those transformations are fairly small. What can be complex is if companies have implemented operational tooling above those products as platforms themselves. What are the identity and access management rules, the service accounts that they're using? How do they set up? There's a bunch of really powerful tools on both the Google and AWS side to prevent, access from outside services into these individual components. So, and especially as you move up a layer into compliance and certification, some of the individual named products have been included by compliance vendors to say, like, I know how to certify this on Lambda. I'm not sure if I can certify it on Cloud Native or on Knative or on something else. They're not, they haven't been in market as long. So that's one whole half. The whole other half is people who have built on a single cloud, but let's call it not particularly cloud native, right? Like, they have built a whole bunch of stuff on virtual machines and a lot of virtual machines, and they have their Active Directory on a virtual machine, and they have their queue on a virtual machine, and every conceivable part of this thing runs on a VM. And so I think many of the migrations to Anthos fall into this camp of people that are trying to attack modernization goals writ large. And some of those places aren't about moving a VM into another VM on GCP or a VM into a container. You can use Anthos Migrate to help with that, but really kind of deleting that VM in its entirety and replacing it with a managed service in either environment, whether that's like a managed queue like PubSub or, especially in data warehousing, things like that. People have built these giant virtualized infrastructures for doing data warehousing. A big opportunity that Anthos presents is being able to get network adjacent to stuff like BigQuery and these other great tools. So it's not every migration is the same. And the more lift and shift your architecture is, the more opportunities Anthos presents as just another ingredient in this overall modernization trajectory. So we got another question that came in. This one's kind of near and dear to my heart, about data stores, about how do people approach stateful systems in GKE and in Anthos? Is that the same on AWS deployments? Is it different? A critical bit is, Anthos doesn't have any inbuilt handling for explicit user addressable APIs for any of the storage types, right? So there's no Anthos file store, there's no Anthos object storage, there's no Anthos block server. Kubernetes can reach down and interact with those services, so you can make a persistent volume claim and attach to on AWS to EBS volumes, or on GCP to GKE volumes, or in deployments on VMware to persistent storage that's present in the VMware cluster. So block is something that Anthos at least mediates your connectivity to, but it does not have an internal block service. So when you deploy Anthos on AWS, you don't get persistent disks from Google side. You're still talking to the real EBS volumes on the AWS side. The other APIs, GraphQL or building a column store, some kind of KV database, generally today, the best practice that we've seen is using the offers from third-party software providers, which today already operate across many of them. So, files, in the file service area in particular, because so many containerized applications want to work there, there's a great program by Google called Anthos Certified Storage, right? So the folks from Robin.io, some of the stuff that's in Brook, the pieces from NetApp, some of those other workloads are allowing filers that work in a distributed way, that work following Anthos's control and observation and monitoring tools. When you move outside of file system and block device, though, and you get to the rest, it gets complicated. So you've got all this other software to look through, whether you're on the relational side, you're looking through SkySQL or MariaDB or MySQL or Postgres. Some of those are managed, some of them are unmanaged. So I think it's an important part of any sort of solution design, whether you're doing KV, that'd be ScyllaDB, or the Cassandra people. If you're doing, document store, that's MongoDB, or there are other solutions there too. Each of those areas, there's such a huge ecosystem, and I think there's still a lot of runway for those businesses to get up to a place where it's just a push button deployment that runs in every one of the locations and is automatically replicating between them. The Kubernetes marketplace seems like where that stuff is going to come from. Be rad to be able to go to the marketplace on the GCP console and say, yeah, I want a cluster that deploys across all three and automatically replicates and has secured communications with that. Those buttons aren't quite there yet. Any views to like programs or places where ISVs that want to have their stuff be compatible with that should reach out to Xiaowen? Like, any idea on how even providers like me at SADA, where we could go help make it so that those kind of stateful questions become something that have better and better answers over time?
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. So we have a marketplace, which I haven't mentioned so far in this webinar, but yeah, we have a marketplace where a lot of the storage providers, database providers have their apps, so you can actually, with one click, actually install a database onto your cluster. So definitely, we have a lot of relationships with some of these partners, and definitely, it's one of the these use cases that we need to jointly go after. So I think when I was saying that we're way out of time, so I'm gonna put up.
It's true.
So I'm gonna just put up one last slide here with the contact us information. So all right, so if you would like to learn more, it's very easy to contact us. So there is a link there for Google. And I think, Miles, you have an offer as well, right, on the side?
Yeah, go back a slide. We've built a flat rate program that can help you get all of this technology we described, including the demo that I just showed, deployed in an environment under your control. If you want that on-prem, we can supply hardware. If you want it in AWS, we'll help you get that set up. It includes all the licensing that's required, handles installation, handles training and support, onboarding. You can come out being an Anthos superstar. You'll answer all these questions on the next webinar. So if you're interested in that, it's just sada.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Miles and Xiaowen. That was crazy informative, and I am so happy that we had you both on for this. This is awesome. I just want to thank you both for joining us, and I want to thank everyone else for attending today's live stream webinar. Following today's live stream, you will receive an email with a link to the on-demand recording, so you can watch it as many times as you'd like. And we will also be sending a survey where you can provide feedback on today's live stream webinar. And if you have any additional questions that you'd love answered, please ask them within that survey. On behalf of myself and the team at SADA and Google, thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Cheers.